Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rita Tritcher, senior business writer and columnist with the Globe and Mail. I am very pleased to be your moderator for this session. I'm speaking to you today from the Globe and Mail Center in Toronto. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the Globe is headquartered is the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. As a settler, I am grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. Today, we're gathered virtually for an important discussion about women and the tax system. And we have a distinguished panel of speakers for this important session. So here's a rundown of what you can expect. We will begin with a moderated discussion, but of course, we want to make this session as interactive as possible. And that means our audience members will also have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. So if you have a question, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be watching for questions from the audience throughout the hour, and I will do my best to get to as many of them as I can during our allotted time. So without any further ado, I will introduce our speakers. First, we have Kimberly Brooks. She has a few different titles. She is a professor of law, a professor of accounting, and dean at the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University. Dr. Brooks's research focuses on all things tax. She cares especially about the consequences of tax design on civil society. Next, we have Haijin Mu. She is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan's Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. Her research interests include fiscal policy and health policy, and her background is in economics. We also have Bhuvana Rai. She is a tax lawyer with EY Law in Toronto, which has a diverse tax advisory and disputes practice. Bhuvana has worked in both government and private sector contexts. She is also a former clerk of the Tax Court of Canada. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Kathleen Leahy. She is a professor, Queen's National Scholar, and Patricia Montour Distinguished University Professor at Queen's University. Kathleen is a member of the Ontario and Illinois Bars, associate member of Garden Court Chambers in the UK, and sits on the boards of the UK-based Tax Justice Network and the steering committee of its global parent, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. I want to jump right into our discussion. I'd like to start by setting the table a bit for our audience members who may have varying degrees of knowledge about the tax system. And so there is this impression that the tax system is supposed to be neutral. So how exactly does the tax system intersect with gender equality or inequality? Or to put it another way, why should people who care about advancing gender equality, also care about the tax system? I'd like to hear from all of you on this question, and I want to do it in this order. We'll do Kimberly, Haijin, Bhuvana, and then Kathleen. So Kimberly, make sure that you're unmuted and go for it.
Thanks, Rita. So let me dive in and I love this question because so often I find myself in a room and people say, tax, it looks neutral. There's nothing in there that talks about gender or race. And so what are you talking about when you say the tax system matters for all of us who care about advancing the position of equity deserving groups? And so I'll talk about maybe 4 different spheres where I think it matters, and I'll do it all briefly, and then others can kind of jump in where they think it's most interesting to them. So, the first thing I'd say is, of course, the tax system, the kind of actual legal framework has 2 different things embedded in it. And others on this panel, and I'm sure in the audience, have explored those. There's a cluster of those rules that are really sort of spending programs that we're delivering through the Income Tax Act and other tax laws. And that will make lots of sense, I think, to folks in the audience. You can imagine how a disability tax credit or a child tax credit, for example, has massive ramifications for women, racialized women, Indigenous women, and so on. And so that piece is usually pretty easy to wrap your head around, even if you don't think of it necessarily as about tax. The kind of second layer, I'd say, is there's all kinds of structural features of the system that have profoundly gendered implications. So for example, our decision to only tax half of the returns from capital gains, really makes a big difference if it turns out you're a high income earner. And of course, it's no surprise that when you look, those are mostly white folks, they're mostly men. And so, that kind of piece that looks more structured has these natural implications, design implications that have very different effects based on where folks kind of stand in the kind of distribution of the resources of society. And then the kind of third frame I'd say is there's kind of a nation to nation framing, right? And so Indigenous folks have a very different relationship, I think, with the tax system than settlers. And that's not obvious when you look at the kind of standard tax language, and the nation to nation relationship around tax has been quite fraught, I think, in this country. And then there's kind of a second layer to that, which is, Canada as a nation relative to other nations in the world. And Kathleen, for example, has done a lot of work in that space and may want to weigh in a bit about that. But there's kind of a really interesting, internation equity and equality concerns that we should dig into. And then the last thing is, of course, there's all kinds of really interesting questions just about the experience of being engaged in tax as someone who's part of an equity deserving group, if you're in tax practice or a tax academic and so on. And so I think there are kind of nice questions to ask there about why we should care. So maybe with that kind of framing, I'll stop and see where others think it's interesting to dig in.
Okay, I'll call on Haijian next.
Thanks, Kim, for this very interesting introduction. My view is the tax system is designed to be gender or race neutral, which serves the so-called horizontal equity principle. So there's an advantage to that design, which is kind of put everybody in a taxpayer identity, which kind of level playing field. But my point is, it's actually not a level playing field before we enter this tax system. So horizontal equity is supposed to be treating people with same earning potential in the same way in the tax system. But currently, because the design, women and men start with a different opportunity to participate in labor market, because they have different bargaining power in the family, and the default choice for women is family, right? And for men is career. So even they have the same ability or earning potential, they cannot really have an opportunity to generate the same income. So I think this horizontal equity was valid before even we start with the tax system. The taxpayer identity actually disguises this horizontal equity to a certain degree. I will stop here.
Okay, Bhuvana.
Hi, everyone. So I think, after Kim and Haijian's introductions, there's not, too much more to say, but one thing I would highlight is that when we look at promoting economic growth and poverty reduction, development efforts have to ensure that policy interventions and taxation don't negatively affect desired outcomes in gender equality. So, I mean, we don't necessarily look so much at policies that are deliberately excluding women or that are deliberately gender biased, but often what happens is that there's implicit bias that underlies these policies, and that the actual impact is maybe different than what a gender blind analysis would have indicated at the start. So I think that really there needs to be a discussion of the way in which governments raise revenues that may have different impacts on women and men.
Okay, Kathleen, I'm going to give you the last word on this question.
Okay, and I hate to be kind of a spoiler, but the reality that I've come to accept and recognize, really fear and hate, is one that is found in how we report on the impact of gender on the use of the revenues produced by tax laws, and how they themselves are built into the whole budget process. I have one slide that shows what this looks like from the Canadian perspective, and emphasizing that everyone has from the beginning, especially from the beginning of claiming ground for gender equality in the Convention for the Eradication of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in the early 1980s, followed by the Convention followed by the Beijing Platform for Action with all of its really specific provisions as to what the fiscal system looks like in paragraph 58 for people who want to look at it. This Canada graph actually demonstrates that it is a hotbed of deliberate, persistent, politically driven, yet presumably on its face, equal outcomes for women as compared to men. And I can't show you this Canada graph from this end of things, but what it basically shows is that starting in 1995, in fact, Canada was ranked #1 on gender equality in all of the UN indices. And that persisted for several years, but it was only until the Beijing Platform for Action came into effect that Canada started looking at how to really optimize that. It persisted in that for a few years, but after that, it's really been pretty well all downhill on gender equality impacts. And what is so shocking is that, particularly during what I would refer to as the Harper years, there was a deliberate, explicit searching out for the provisions that were most favorable to women, and they all really got cut back, restructured, or in some other way turned into a negative kind of outcome. I think this is perhaps the wrong image. This is the one that relates to Tunisia, which is on some sort of related points. But the Canada graph shows that, in fact, Canada has fallen as low in recent years to being ranked 25th in the world on gender inequality measures. And the biggest component of this, it's measured as a percentage of tax revenues themselves as a percentage of GDP, show that even when the GDP is going up, the tax ratio can go up, but gender equality can go down. The only exception to that I've seen recently is a slight sort of like unwillingness for the impact of the tax system to become even more harmful to women as the pandemic years have approached. And that began showing up already in 2019. The data for the sort of COVID years that are full years is still difficult to pin down, but there is so much embedded discrimination and gender inequality in the outcomes of the total tax transfer system, particularly on a disposable income and consumable income basis, that is what you have to survive on. Women are losing compared to men, and they're losing compared even to women in different income groups, but all women at all income levels are unequal to men in those same deciles. It's really a very important thing to understand about this system in Canada because it's hidden so deeply in tax laws and tax cases. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, well, you've raised an important point about how we use tax revenue and, you know, the gendered effects that can have. Bhuvan, I wanted to ask you, though, just as a point of clarity, is gender or other kind of intersectionality, such as race, specifically mentioned in tax legislation?
So it's not part of tax legislation per se, but recently the government implemented something called the Gender Budgeting Act in 2018 as part of their budget. So while it's not in the tax legislation, it is part of our budget and our budget analysis. I will say that's not new. So it's been a very long time in the making, and the government actually started talking about gender budgeting back in 1995. It's been a long-term project, and now we finally have this act that requires most legislation, including the federal budget, which is a very important document for tax law, to be evaluated from a gender perspective, and not just gender, so all sorts of other inequities. And you know, it's not the only country that's doing this. So we have a lot of OECD countries considering the impacts of gender and gender-based budgeting. So this is something new. We've only seen it for a couple of years now. In the first couple of years, we only got analysis on the impacts of various programs and tax spending on women and the prospective analysis of legislation and its impact on women. But now we're looking at other classes and groups of people as part of the expansion of the GBA plus analysis.
Okay, I'm going to come back to this, the budget's gender analysis in a little bit, but Kimberly, I'm wondering if if it's not a problem with legislation necessarily, Kathleen's already talked about how part of the problem here has to do with how we end up using tax revenues in Canada and the gendered effects that might have. But I'm also wondering if it is, if there's a problem with how the tax system is administered, perhaps not in terms of how the revenues are used, but just kind of on the front end. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'd say that the challenge comes at each of the levels that you've identified, Rita, like the gender neutrality of the legislation may or may not in and of itself be problematic, but the way we analyze it and understand its effects are hugely problematic. And those, that knowledge that we have from that analysis has to inform the policymaking and legislative drafting process. And Kathy sort of mentioned the cases. That's another piece where you see courts interpreting that legislation in particular factual contexts, and they have all kinds of opportunities in that moment, I think, to advance gender equality that they miss or kind of deliberately undermine. And then you're right, the administration piece presents yet another challenge. And one of the kind of fundamental pieces there, and there's been good research done on this, has been around, the main administrative body is the Canada Revenue Agency, and they have a very particular expertise that they've historically looked for in recruiting people, and they have talented auditors and folks working in the CRA. I mean, they're marvelous and they work incredibly hard, but they're not trained as gender equality experts, and they could be. That'd be one way through it, or another way through it would be to think about how expertise that resides in other departments and ministries across government could be more active in contributing to the analytical framework. So, I think about when we're talking about the gender-based GBA plus analysis that shows up as part of the budget process. I mean, folks there again are like doing hard work and they're doing their best, but we've had people like, Kathleen Leahy or I think about people like Claire Young or my colleague Faye Woodman, who have been doing this work for, like, again, 50 years, you know what I mean? And have done rich, thoughtful, detailed work. And that is just not what's showing up in the reports that we're getting yet. And so we're really missing the opportunity. We were one of the very first countries to have academics doing work in this space and doing thoughtful, critical work. And that hasn't been captured in the way that the policy making is being developed and then implemented administratively and otherwise is, I think, actually just a real loss for us.
It always strikes me how this same theme is repeated over and over again when it comes to public policy. We have such smart academics in this country who do such thoughtful research, and then policymakers and legislators have this opportunity right at their fingertips to implement, and then they fail to do so repeatedly. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the pandemic because the tax system was used to deliver key emergency support programs such as the CERB, CRB, and also even the federal, sick pay benefit that was there. Did those pandemic support programs or the delivery of those programs have gendered elements or create gendered effects? Hai-Jen, I want to start with you.
Rita, this is not a topic that I'm quite familiar with, but if I can, I want to add that those financial help from government for those family supplement doesn't really solve this the key problem in the family, which is time. And in a lockdown situation, money does help, but it doesn't help much with addressing giving women more time. So I think I want to come back to the point. The cost of any government program have to recognize this is essentially a time problem, not just money problem. And it's a social problem, not just a tax or fiscal policy problem. If I can use this opportunity to talk about the budgeting issue, which you just mentioned, the technical part, which the panelists mentioned, this we like this opportunity to translate research to policy. It's part of because this technical expertise, how to design a budgeting system which is based on which address both this political or social objective, but also building in this budgeting system is incremental budgeting, performance budgeting, or in a new way, there's a well-being-based budgeting, right? So there are different budgeting systems, which is already entrenched in the government system. So we need this ability to really so translate those academic research, but recognize the reality of budgeting, the system itself. I will stop here.
Kathleen, what about you? Did you have any thoughts about the pandemic, the delivery of programs? You know, I was thinking about the federal sick leave benefit. It's been widely recognized as being poorly designed. The take-up was poor. And of course, we also had the provinces that were, you know, almost completely derelict in their duty to provide proper paid sick leave. You know, was that because there was an assumption that women are primary caregivers, would automatically pick up the slack, or perhaps there's an assumption that gender overlaps with lower income workers? So I'm trying to distill whether the problems, you know, with certain programs were rooted in tax policy, program design, delivery, or, you know, sociological failings. It sounds like it might be all of the above, but maybe I'll let you answer the question.
It's a difficult question to answer, but I think that it's pretty clear that, first of all, Canada was one of the first countries to come forward with its pandemic responses. Clearly, it had put some careful thought into that. But when you do the math, the CERB and the things that look as if they're going to go to private citizens really account for just a tiny bit of what has actually been expended or failed to be spent at all in various parts of the country at various levels of government. And that has, over time, apparently had the impact of helping prod women who were already challenged in being able to stay in the paid workforce, given the nature of the whole unpaid care industry and the significant existence of an informal economy that goes well beyond care issues, that itself has managed to take a lot of people right out of the tax transfer system. And even though the quality of data has been increasing on various dimensions, including with respect to Indigenous peoples and various marginalized, intersectional, and multiple forms of discrimination that have gone on, groups of people, there is still a really sort of pervasive structural deficiency in the whole way that the funding for the pandemic has been addressed. And that, I think, has really driven the incredible shift toward really working conditions that had been overcome by women in Canada in the 1970s are being recreated now. And those have to have some generational and intergenerational effects. So what the recovery time for that is going to be is really very difficult to predict at this point. But, okay. But you see this pattern in every country, and Canada seems to have been one of the biggest offenders in this way.
Okay, great. I'd like to bring Bhuvana into the conversation at this point too. I mean, what is your critique of how these emergency support programs were delivered through the tax system? What could have been done better?
I really just want to echo Kathleen's comments on this, because I think a lot of the perspectives and the analysis that is done is taking, okay, so we have the CERB, we have these various individual support programs, how are they affecting women as opposed to the general population? And so we've had a lot of analysis on that from the government, and they've published that and said, oh, women are slightly more likely to receive the CERB. And it's really interesting because the bulk of the money obviously went to businesses. And, you know, for example, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy was $68 billion last year of federal funds. And this year, I think it was something close to $30 billion. So the CERB is minuscule in comparison. It's hard to really overstate the extent to which the CERB does not matter in the field of federal expenditures when you're comparing it to programs that are this big, that are such a high proportion of government spending. And one of the interesting things is that when you look at the GBA plus analysis, they say, well, we don't have gender statistics, and so we assume it's equal, right? It's remarkable because that's not the right way to look at legislation. And it is particularly concerning because that shouldn't be the way that you evaluate whether or not a program is successful is to assume that it is going to be gender neutral. And I think this really goes back to some of the things that we were all talking about at the beginning when we talk about implicit and explicit bias in tax legislation and tax policy. This can also happen when you're evaluating it, right? And that's part of the role of academics and the really fantastic policy advisors we've had throughout decades, actually, in Canada, talking about these programs and the actual impact on people, is that we don't actually have sophisticated analysis from the government when it comes to GBA plus, because they're analyzing themselves. I can't imagine that they're going to want to release something that says, yeah, we really shouldn't have done that. So I guess that's a lot of different commentary, but really I can't echo more Kathleen's comment about the fact that, we're considering a lot of these individual programs when really what we should be looking at is the big picture. And the honest truth is that we're not evaluating the big picture very well.
Okay, I hear what you're both saying about how the supports for individuals were just a smaller proportion of kind of the larger emergency support. I am wondering though, and I'll put this question to Kimberly, whether there were any bright spots or successes at leveling the playing field with respect to providing COVID supports to individuals through the tax system. I'm wondering, I suppose specifically about the CERB and the CRB programs, to the extent that the government dropped the employment requirement threshold for those programs, meaning the number of hours one needed to have worked or the amount of employment income needed to qualify, and also considering that the replacement rate was higher for lower income workers. Some might argue that had some equalizing effects. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I like to look for bright spots. That's my leaning. Although I have to say in this one, the inequalities that sat beneath all of these programs were so profound that, we're talking fine slices. But what I took some hope from, Rita, is exactly what you say, which is it turns out the government can implement relatively substantial programming relatively quickly. And we've spent a lot of time having conversations that take forever and never kind of land. And yet it turns out we can do it, and we can actually move some of the pieces and do a little bit of testing, right? We can say, let's reduce some of the barriers to entry for these programs. Let's try to figure out what might be feasible. Yep, we all admitted at the beginning this wasn't going to be perfect and that there were going to be challenges, but we were going to do it kind of anyway. And if we had to sort of reconcile things at the back end, we would do that. And I think that was heartening for me, like the kind of willingness, the willingness to be able to actually take a chance on something, develop something and get it going quickly was, for me, at least in my lifetime, quite a substantial change to what I've seen in terms of the pace of policy reform. And there's something heartening about that. If we can actually, open up the space that says we have really important changes we can make that will make a big difference for a variety of different equality deserving groups, and the government has the will, we can actually do those things. And so I guess if, I'm digging a bit, Rita, but there's a bright spot for me in this.
Okay, great. I always try to be a little bit balanced here when providing, a look at what's happened. Okay, so you have all mentioned that the government does a gender analysis as part of its budget. I really do want to dive into that topic now in a bit more detail. What have we learned about gender and the tax system from that analysis? And, what have we learned that needs to change? What are some actionable items? And Haijen, I'm going to start with you.
So I want to have kind of two layers of these comments. One is a lower, like a hanging fruit. The other one is a higher level. So the lower layer is like what we are talking about. The budgeting system could be changed. Kimberly mentioned this is a bright spot of government. If government has a political will to do something, they will make it happen, right? So the budgeting system in New Zealand, currently there's a well-being-based budgeting, which is even more than gender-based budgeting. So in their budget design, they have outcome indicators. The outcome indicator includes a group of well-being indicator. If a spender ministry such as healthcare, education, when they put when they make their spending plan, they have to also justify how those spending work towards achieving those social economic outcome. There's supposed some evaluation, just like Boana mentioned, evaluation later on, which will be based on those indicators. So the budgeting system, there's lots of debate about how do we change from the current budgeting system to a more like a social, orientated system. And there it's happening in New Zealand. And one of my PhD students is studying that, see whether Canada has that condition check. What condition do we need to achieve that? This is a lower level. The second level is I want to come back to Kathleen's point about this kind of hidden agenda of behind our tax system. Particularly the Harper years, there's, for example, income splitting system, right? So behind it, there's a family policy agenda, isn't it? So it's under the name of helping family, give family a higher financial gain. But actually behind it is agenda of promoting this stay-at-home mom kind of prototype. So why so far we haven't have a national child care program? Why so far women cannot still participate in labor market? Because the entire system was designed implicitly to perpetuate that situation. So unless we recognize the system is not fair from the beginning, right? Equal treatment is actually not equitable, then there's no way we can really change the system. I will stop here.
That's a great point. We're going to jump into the child care question shortly, but I do want to hear from everyone else about what their takeaways were from the budget's gender analysis. And I'm going to ask Bhuvana next.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I want to highlight too is the very small number of people that are actually thinking about making these policies, both from the government and from the perspective of the standing committees. And one of the issues that we have, which I'm not sure really that anyone other than a policy wonk really gets into, is that most of these decisions, most of these evaluations go up to the standing committees on finance and human resources. Now, if we look at the gender composition of those committees, and in particular, the gender composition of the experts that they call, you see two things, I'm sure you'll see many things, but there's two things I want to highlight, which is that firstly, things that relate to gender balance and EDI generally are relegated to the Committee on Human Resources and Labor, as opposed to the Committee on Finance. But the Committee on Finance is the one that discusses and primarily makes decisions on taxation. They overwhelmingly call male experts, and they overwhelmingly do not discuss the breakdown and the impact of GBA plus analysis. That's not a rule, but it is an overwhelming trend. And I think that when we think about the way that GBA plus analysis is performed and utilized, you also have to look at the decision makers and the people that are at the table that are making these decisions, because otherwise we're not actually going to have equitable policy, no matter how much the average person or the average civil servant working on GBA plus analysis is interested in those topics. We're never going to get it if, at the end of the day, it is just a biased committee. And not an explicitly biased one, not one that is intending to be biased, but one that is biased by virtue of its composition.
Okay, Kathleen, I saw you nodding. Jump in. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
Free to speak. My own experience really reinforces what's being said. I spent far too many hours on the gender equality committee, the gender committee that had been set up, doing just amazing work for them because they really wanted to know everything, right? And spoiler alert here, there is sex disaggregated data dripping from everything everywhere in this whole country, and it's easy to find. Much of it resides in the social policy micro simulation software that is being updated and was rapidly updated, although possibly not terribly accurately in relation to Ontario, in relation to the pandemic. So this data is out there and it can be received. It's not even costly data to use. it is so sex, gender, and other identities disaggregated that it isn't funny. So how the government could have gone from using that technology back in the early days of the Beijing Platform for Action, beginning in 1995, and then, oops, forgot to keep doing it, and then had to rediscover and ignore that history really quite recently and call it gender-based analysis is beyond me, because there are many, many times when every tiny piece of every budget has been picked apart and shown all of its pieces in various committees. But the committee that had the hardest time even sitting through presentations on the things that the gender committee was trying to really accelerate and hold the government of the day's feet to the fire with, they could barely stand to even let anybody talk. And it was just like going in and just reciting something and nobody heard it and it got ignored, and then they could move on because they could check the gender box, right? So there is a deeply, deeply seated reluctance on the part of any government, really, since the 1990s, that have really pursued the data. And when the data becomes available, it's really hard to get it before anybody in the government who's really going to want to take a close look at it. So it's a big, big challenge. And this is a challenge of communication and who gets to talk to the rulers, the government.
Okay, Kimberly, I'm wondering if you have any added critique on the federal budget gender analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit broken record-y on this, Rita, only because I think the message is so clear that we actually have incredible expertise, particularly in gender in the country. And then when you look at the GBA plus analysis, it's so thin. And again, that's not to be critical. There's like so few people that are doing it in government. Of course it's thin, right? It's hard to be great without buy-in and then without resources that people can get kind of trained and learn how to adopt those approaches. Like every time I'm trying to think through how to analyze something, I pull any of the, 25 fabulous rooted reports that Kathleen has done, for example, for Alberta or UNB or the country or other countries around the world. And there's a framework for how to approach these things, and it's thick and detailed and rich, and there's data to support it. And it's wonderful work, and it should be work that's either being used in government policy or that at least that methodology is being taken seriously and adopted. And so I think, my key message on this is that we actually have a natural resource we are absolutely not using in this space. And then I'd pick up on what Bhuvana says too, having appeared before those committees occasionally over the years. Like the sort of staffing of those committees is very problematic. And not only are you not heard, like there's a real resistance. You always have to start from, well, why does it matter the tax system is neutral? And we just shouldn't be starting there anymore. Like it's so much work to be saying that for 40 years in a row, And so I feel like the rest of government, lots of the rest of government has caught up, and yet for some reason, often in finance, we're just so far behind. And the last piece I'd say about it, and then I'll stop, is just there's nothing hard about this, right? Like there's sort of a perception sometimes that tax is highly technical, and so we're just going to leave it to the people who happen to find some affinity with something called finance. And yet, a kind of program of education with any cluster of people in government would have them relatively well prepared to ask thoughtful questions and engage in interesting ways and push policymakers to do better. And lots of people are hungry for and interested in that, I think. And so, one of the kind of groundswells I'd love to see out of some of this is just a lot more interest across a much broader swath of government in these kinds of questions and then engagement on them.
Okay, great. I want to jump into the thorny issue of universal childcare. Obviously, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, like 50 years ago, recommended that we have such a system set up in Canada. I know that we have a government that's talking about making progress towards that now. We have a prime minister who brands himself as a feminist. And there have been individual deals struck with individual provinces. However, people like me remain highly skeptical that this is going to happen within my lifetime or, within my daughter's lifetime, to be quite frank. So I'm just wondering if we could talk about, what is wrong with the current system and, what might we see happen down the road. And so I want to talk a little bit about why the existing provisions for children in our tax system, including the child care expense deduction and Canada Child Benefit, are inadequately designed. So what is the problem? Is it that it only covers a portion of the total child care expenses, and that limit is determined by the lower earning partner's taxable income, and then there's an assumption that that's most probably a woman? Is that what the issue is? Faijan, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Rita. I think our tax system has not recognized probably even half of the cost of raising and educating children. You know, we work 8 or 9 hours a day, but the school runs until like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So who cover that 2 or 3 hours? I mean, who designed the system from the beginning without somebody can be both a full-time worker and coming home to pick up their children or providing childcare? I mean, this it's absurd, you know, this assumption that we can all do that. And this formal childcare, so-called, you know, say government provides tax deduction that you can use that to pay for formal childcare. But formal childcare means somebody is looking over your children, doing coloring book, right? Or do homework. That's the quality of childcare that we can buy using that tax deductible formal so-called childcare expense. I think it's kind of the system failed to recognize if you want women to participate in the labor participation rate to counter this declining fertility rate, immigration trend, you know, then you also don't recognize women cannot be at 2 places. Then this system is wrong. The limit, the real limit of tax deduction, if we still go that route in the tax system, should be the entire cost of those 2 or 3 hours of labor income, right? That's a real opportunity cost of earning labor income. And in addition, there's a quality issue, right? So every mom cares about quality of childcare, not just amount of childcare. So we need a quality childcare. That's why I think this national childcare program, it's absolutely necessary, because it will provide affordable care. For sure, quality we are waiting to see, but at least it gives women assurance, right? So something you can rely on. There's always childcare there when you need it. That's our default starting point for childcare. We need this, it's reach the minimum kind of this national childcare. And also will greatly relieve some of the maternal guilty of many moms. If there's an institutional childcare across the country, you don't feel you are the bad mom who choose work over taking care of your children. So I think we should never underestimate that psychological cost of working mom. It's not just money, right? It's time, it's quality, it's well-being. So the Canada Child Benefit is another story. So far, it doesn't benefit high income or even some middle income family. Francis Woody sent me some statistics. The median couple family, like a family with 2 husband and wife in Toronto, is about 100,000 already in 2019. You know, many just middle class probably won't benefit from this Canada Child Benefit, but there's a cost of raising children for middle and high income class for sure, and they're usually more educated, so the opportunity cost is even higher. So I think the system, it's another reason we need some strong universal policy to really change the social structure, to recognize childcare is a institutional issue, it's a national issue, it's not just a family issue. I think that message itself is important. It probably is more important than the real financial or childcare kind of provision part. I'll stop here.
Okay, Bhuvana, this issue came up during the recent federal election campaign, and during the election campaign, the Conservatives talked about introducing a tax credit to replace the current system that we had. Would that have been a better option, in your view?
I mean, I think there's a lot to say here. I think
just even taking a step back, I think I just want to highlight the economic benefits of having something, right? So we have, the CCB that exists, and it's called the Canada Child Benefit. It's available to eligible Canadian families to help with the cost of raising children. And I think it's important to sort of think about the ways in which that's affected the economy today, because I'm not sure that everyone always comes from the same page there. But it's generally been very good for the economy. When women are able to work, that's actually just very good, because it means that you have half of your workforce available. And I know that that's pretty rudimentary, but not everyone understands or starts from the same premise there. But generally speaking, from an economic perspective, it's really good to have supports for taking care of children, just so everyone can go to work and do their thing. And contribute to the economy. Given that background, I think it makes sense to consider what options we have. Certainly the Conservatives suggested a tax credit model, which I think would build on the existing one, whereas the Liberals are contributing to create a new program that would cost $30 billion and look different in terms of introducing actually program spending through investment in childcare and early childhood learning, so that you can get $10 a day child minding costs through some form or another. And I think that when you're looking at the difference there, it's probably helpful to look at the outcomes from Quebec, which has had lower childcare costs through programs for years. And the outcomes for the economy have been pretty good. They've been generally speaking positive on a revenue from a revenue perspective, where the amount that you spend on the program, you more than recover from the increased participation of women in the economy. I think one of the downsides that maybe people aren't quite as aware of is that the program outcome surveys are a little bit low, but I'm not sure that there's really much of a debate from like an economics or a feminist perspective, but it's clearly better to have some sort of fixed fee daycare program for all the reasons that Hi-Jen has talked about. I mean, I think really it ends up being a question of what parents are actually comfortable with and whether or not they're actually happy with the idea of sending children to center-based daycare. I think that that's one of the things that ends up being a sticking point from a policy perspective. And, I think that that's one sort of lens on this. But the other thing, and I don't mean to take up too much time here, but the other thing that I do want to highlight too is that the fact that we historically and currently just consistently consider childcare to be a woman's expense. Children have two parents. They don't have one parent that is the only person who should socially feel responsible for their child, even if that is the reality. And one of the ways in which our tax code does not reflect this is that, there's this case, it's 2 decades old. It's called Symes. It went to the Supreme Court. And I really want to bring that up because I think it is important to think about why we think of childcare as a women's issue at all, and about women in taxation when it doesn't have to be that way. But there's a case called Symes that went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it was a law firm partner. She was female, and she wanted to deduct the costs of childcare because she couldn't work while taking care of her children from the income that she received. And the Supreme Court, accepting 2 female justices, held that childcare was not a legitimate business expense. And while that sounds from the outset like a reasonable thing to say, okay, you know what, childcare is probably personal instead of business in nature. Historically speaking, like there have been a lot of business expenses that are partly personal and partly business in nature that have been historically deducted by men for decades, right? So golf fees, until specifically mentioned as a deduction that you couldn't take in the Income Tax Act, were, prima facie deductible by primarily men who were golfing with clients. It's partly personal, partly business. And this continues throughout for lots of expenses that are considered to be partly personal and partly business. And so with that background, it's actually really confusing that we wouldn't let someone deduct childcare expenses if that was the only reasonable way that they could work. Like,
you know, you can't just abandon your child either, right? Because it's not just a moral imperative, like it's a criminal offense. So you can't actually abandon your child, and it's not clear why you can't deduct childcare costs if they are the only reason that you can go and earn income from a business. So I guess I think I've more than answered your question by telling you lots about the different options that I think are available for governments to consider. But I would say that, you know, really, I want to think about how we assume that childcare is always going to be, you know, an issue of women taxation as opposed to an issue of families and taxation, which is what I think it should be.
That's an excellent point. I wanted to go to Kim and then to Kathleen, but to find out from you what your thoughts are about where we're going to be on this universal childcare issue in 5 years. Are we still going to be having a large number of people still using the child tax deduction rather than subsidized spots? Like, how do you see this all unfolding? Kim, maybe you can go first.
Okay, Rita, now you've asked me an optimistic question. Do you know what I mean? That I can answer optimistically. I think we're just going to all be in universal childcare. That's my prediction. It's going to be high quality. It's going to be widely available. It's going to be culturally relevant and specific. It's going to be designed by communities, and everyone's going to want their kids there.
Okay, Kathleen, do you share that optimism? Kathleen.
Yes. Well, I can be optimistic too. I strongly believe that somehow out of everything that we're learning from the pandemic, and a big part of it is the lessons that we are learning with respect to just how the economy works, how it really works, right? When things are not going the way we've all expected them to, that we're going to end up with equality for everyone in every country and equality between every country, whether high levels of development, low levels of development, because a massive global redistribution has to take place. And it should take place through both the tax and transfer systems, as well as in the funding for everything else. This is, in fact, the commitment of the United Nations, and it has increasingly gotten almost all of the protocols and various agreements, and short of, you know, harnessing the IMF and the World Bank and making the OECD behave and let other people make decisions for themselves, there are tremendous capabilities globally for actually reclaiming what life should be about. Having said that, however, the current data, and it hasn't budged much over the years, childcare benefit taxable or not taxable, whatever. The latest data that I looked at had the government spending something like, and this is framed a little bit differently than just pure childcare. It's basically all unpaid work that has care consequences associated with it. Something like $26.4 billion being spent, I think in the most recent year that I looked at was 2018, for care facilities. And out of that, a mere tiny $1.4 billion was allocated to the one thing that is visible in the tax system that is actually meant to address women who are in paid work. So there's a huge structure that's kind of, you know, holding us in the past, but the more it's brought into sight and taken apart, and the money is used in more fair and equality promoting ways, then the greater the opportunity for that is. And it's going to take a lot of optimism.
Okay, I'm going to work on being optimistic. I'm really going to work on it. Okay, we only have about 6 minutes left, and there are 2 more questions that I really want to get to. One is from the audience, and one is from me. But I think it was Kim that you had emailed me about talking about what are the implications of the current tax system on advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I'm wondering if you can touch on that briefly.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I want to flag, and we've had quite a ranging conversation that's focused primarily around gender, and that's an important piece of the overarching puzzle. I would say that, to the extent that Canada has had academics, I think, who have provided lots of models the government can borrow from on gender analysis, we've been much lighter on academics who can provide that kind of framework around Indigenous peoples and the development of tax systems and nation-to-nation relations. And the same thing I'd say around race. Like, we don't have the rich literature that even the Americans have in the academic space on this, on kind of how we think through some of these challenges, how we think about the implications of our tax systems. And so in the context of Indigenous peoples, I mean, there's a couple of questions there. Like, one is just, how does the current system actually affect Indigenous peoples around their decision making and their kind of life circumstances? And there's a bit of work on that, but the bigger and more profound question is, I think, really, how do we deal with the tax system as one of the instruments of kind of colonial economic warfare, right? And I think that is a huge challenge that we haven't confronted as a country, and at least as academics, I think we have not done, some of us, at least myself included, have not done the work that we've needed to do to be able to provide the same rich framework that could be ignored by governments on that issue as we have on the gender issue. And so, in our kind of email exchanges, I flagged it because I'm so conscious when I'm teaching, for example, or trying to think through issues myself about where I have lots of rich material available and where I feel like there's still so much thinking to be developed and shared and so many conversations to be had, and the context of reconciliation and the way that we can actually try to think more creatively and inventively and thoughtfully about the tax system and how we partner with Indigenous nations to develop that tax system in a way that is kind of co-created and makes some sense in the light of different circumstances, strikes me as a real imperative in this era.
Okay, thank you. We could have an entire session just on that one topic, and I feel like it's a little unfortunate that we only had about 3 minutes to address a very important issue. So thank you for that. For talking about the complexities there. I appreciate that. We do have a question from somebody in the audience, and I'm not really sure who to direct this to, because it could be to any of you. During the pandemic, schools were closed and women were highly impacted. I'm wondering if there was any study looking into the impact of school closures and whether this removed women from the workforce, and how this removal of women from the workforce impacted taxes. Anyone familiar with the study that's going on right now?
I can talk about the productivity, the labor part, but the tax part, I'm not sure. Maybe I can start. There's some research which shows women's labor productivity and labor participation was affected more negatively than men. There was a recent article cited by The Economist magazine, which shows even female academics, which are quite resistant to the influence of those issues, have a lower paper submission rate than their male academic counterpart. So and there's also a study which shows after the pandemic ease out, the rate of women who resume or return to their former work, the ratio is lower than men. So this must have some influence on the the revenue from the labor participation of women, I guess. Maybe some other panelists have something to add.
Anybody else aware of any other studies? Okay. In the 1 minute and 47 seconds we have left, I want to do a little bit of a speed round. If you could each give your one ask of the federal government in terms of reform. Yvonne, I want to start with you.
Okay, I would like them to ensure that the decision makers on the subcommittees that deal with taxation and tax policy and tax legislation are diverse in the way that they want their impact of legislation to be.
And Kathleen?
What I would say is that the government has to expose the fact that it is still in the business of manufacturing poverty for women throughout their life course, and they will live longer, but with much less in the way of pensions, let alone any kinds of assets. And every single stage of their lives is going to whittle away at that to get to that end point, so that there has to be a complete rethinking. There's really no one change that can miraculously solve the problems that are currently being faced in every single country.
Okay, and Kimberly and Hai-Jen, just quickly, your one ask.
Yeah, look, so I have a long list of asks, but just to summarize it, I'd say they should call the 3 other panelists. You know what I mean? That would be my strong recommendation.
Yeah, Hai-Jen, I'll give you the last word.
My recommendation is that the government should recognize our tax system is not horizontally equitable in many dimensions, including gender.
Okay, great. We're going to have to leave our discussion there. We are out of time. Thank you to Kimberly, Hai-Jen, Bhuvana, and Kathleen for providing such valuable insights. And thank you also to everyone in the audience who tuned in for today's discussion. I'm going to throw it back to the organizers.